If the New York Times is the American paper of record, the Washington Post is the paper of the DC establishment. Regarded as a liberal paper, lionized in the movie All the President's Men for its expose of the corrupt Nixon administration during the Watergate scandal, groaning with Pulitzer Prizes, the paper has generally been reviled by the right wing of the American establishment. Conservatives deride it as the Pravda on the Potomac, and that old reactionary pugilist FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover compared it to the Communist Party's newspaper, The Daily Worker. The paper is nonetheless surprisingly conservative. The Post generally supports American wars. It backed Bush's war on Iraq in 2003 and, as Media Matters points out, spun several lies in the process. In 2013, as Iraq was once more about to descend into civil war, it still spoke of the fragile gains of the Iraq War in its lead editorial, and the next year was calling for yet another war. It is also a ferocious cheerleader for America's so-called free trade agreements. It still defends NAFTA despite even mainstream Democrats moving back from it, and today its op-eds loudly champion new free trade deals because you can't stop the trade machine. Notably, like most of the US press, the Washington Post has been consistently pro-Israel, a stance which included backing Israel's shocking and globally denounced assault on Gaza in 2009. And as we will see, however, the Washington Post is not primarily loyal to an ideology, but to the Democratic Party and to the wing of the ruling class it represents. When founded in 1877, the Washington Post was linked to the Democratic Party, its founder a reporter from the East Coast who would go on to become a Democratic politician. In this era, the Democratic Party was a conservative party of white supremacy and former slaveholders, and had been linked to the Ku Klux Klan when it emerged after the Civil War. The role of the Post in American politics was really formed when it was purchased in 1933 by Eugene Meyer, an extraordinarily wealthy Wall Street investor who worked for successive governments. The Post under Meyer broadly reflected the positions of the Democratic Party, which at this stage had taken over from the Republicans as the main liberal party. But it was also consolidated over time into a DC monopoly, with the main competitor bought out and the ever-growing press giant left as a legacy to his son-in-law Philip Graham and daughter Katharine Graham. Philip Graham was, according to the journalist Deborah Davies, tied to the CIA and a critical component of its Operation Mockingbird, a secret campaign to influence the media. After Philip Graham committed suicide in 1963, the paper was left to Katharine Graham. Catherine the Great, as Deborah Davies memorably dubbed her, was firmly of the Democratic Party establishment, opposed to the social change wrought by the 60s, and even supported Nixon against Hubert Humphrey in 1968. Under her watch, the Post was the last establishment newspaper to oppose the Vietnam War and otherwise maintained a solidly Cold War line in foreign policy. The paper's defining grace moment, however, was during the early 1970s, when it published the Pentagon Papers, leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, which exposed US war crimes in Vietnam, and then in 1973, when two of its journalists took on the Nixon administration and won. Surely this demonstrated the paper's independence from power. In fact, as Deborah Davis' book about the proprietor points out, this was one half of the establishment in battle with another. The Post sources were state officials worried by and opposed to Nixon's criminal excesses, and the infamous Deep Throat was most likely a CIA agent, just like many of the Post's journalists. The individuals involved in breaking the story were hardly anti-government zealots. The executive editor at the time, Ben Bradley, another Washington Post employee with close links to the CIA, had played a critical role in the press smear campaign against Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Nevertheless, the paper had a huge cultural impact at the time, and this era is still regarded as a heroic phase in its existence. However, it also coincided with Katharine Graham's decision to turn the Post into a public company and to engage in a concerted drive to push up profits and shareholder value. In the ensuing years, Graham, in a new alliance with the now billionaire investor Warren Buffett, dragged the Post farther to the right. During the Reagan years, the Washington Post was consistently supportive of the fundamental principles behind the government's death squad policy in Latin America and fanatically opposed to the success of the left-wing Sandinista government in Nicaragua. And as the CIA was ravaging Central America, the Post's links with the spooks continued. In 1988, Katharine Graham, according to Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting in a piece about the establishment paper, addressed a room full of CIA recruits and gave them the Washington Post version of the free press. There are some things the general public does not need to know, and shouldn't. I believe democracy flourishes when the government can take legitimate steps to keep its secrets, and when the press can decide whether to print what it knows. The Post was also strongly supportive of George Bush Sr.'s war in Iraq. As Bill Moyers points out in his documentary Buying the War for PBS, this included 27 editorials supporting Bush's goal. Its analysis when the war ended lamented that the US Army had not deposed Saddam Hussein, but celebrated that US bombing had battered the enemy to near senselessness. By the mid-1990s, the Post star journalists were taking on not the rich and powerful, but America's poor. Bob Woodward in 1994 co-wrote a major front-page article attacking disability benefits for children on the grounds that many recipients were possibly not truly disabled, and anyway, the parents spent the money unwisely. The headline, Costs Over Children's Disability Program, How 26 Words Cost the Taxpayers Billions in New Entitlement Payments. This being right in the middle of the Clinton White House's planned assault on welfare was a highly convivial note for the paper to strike for its Democratic Party allies. The Washington Post ultimately stakes its reputation on the quality of its journalism and its accumulated batch of Pulitzers, and indeed it would be churlish to deny that serious work has been done on subjects ranging from Watergate to the NSA spying on US citizens. However, the Post's coverage is, as the media critics Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman would predict, usually confined within the DC mainstream. Being a corporate concern, dependent on advertising revenue, speaking largely to privileged audiences, and with close ties to the American state, there are limits to its ability to tell the truth. Further, its editorial standards have been known to collapse when faced with the prospect of a Pulitzer. Before the New York Times' Jason Blair, there was the Washington Post's Janet Cook, who in 1981 brought the paper to a devastating low after producing a made-up tale of an 8-year-old African-American heroin addict, inciting a campaign led by the DC mayor Marion Barry to find the boy. Although the Post admitted that at least one of its editors, Alpin Brownlee, had sensed the story to be false and later admitted to smelling a scandal, the paper stood by it, and Bob Woodward submitted it for a Pulitzer Prize, which it won. The story fell apart within less than a year, and the prize had to be returned. The fact that Woodward either didn't notice a fraud or overlooked it may or may not be related to allegations that he himself fabricated a deathbed interview with former CIA Director William Casey. The Los Angeles Times said that Woodward's claims were a fabrication, and Casey's widow denied that he even entered the room. But perhaps more telling is what the Washington Post does when faced with genuine revelations which call into question the political establishment that it represents. It closes ranks. The case study here is Gary Webb, whose revelations in the San Jose Mercury News concerning the alliance between the CIA, the Nicaraguan Contras, and international arms and drugs dealers resulted in a nationwide furore. Webb showed that the CIA was using drug money raised from selling cocaine in American inner cities. Though the story was in its essentials true, the Washington Post led the attempts by the national media to destroy it and the journalists behind it. As Alexander Coburn put it in a story for The Nation on the death of Gary Webb, squadrons of hacks, some of them with career-long ties to the CIA, unloaded their venom on Webb. The New York Times, itself hardly innocent in this affair, reviewed a film about Gary Webb, Kill the Messenger, which recalled a reporter wrongly disgraced. This article states that even the Post's own ombudsman found the paper's attack on Webb excessive, suggesting that it showed more passion for sniffing out the flaws in San Jose's answer than for sniffing out a better answer themselves. At around about the same time as Webb's story was being trashed, the Post also helped cover up another story related to the same period. This was President Bill Clinton's links to a West Arkansas airbase which had been used by the Reagan administration to send supplies to the Nicaraguan Contras and bring cocaine back to the US. It seems that the state finances in Clinton's period may have been bolstered by drugs money. In 1995, two Post journalists, Sally Denton and Roger Morris, had prepared a full investigation, but it was quashed before publication by the managing editor without any explanation. So, the Washington Post, having supported the elimination of the Sandinista government, its senior personnel being tied to the CIA, had tried to suppress the truth of that war, and faced with a real story telling a dark truth about America's empire and its racist drugs war, it was on the side of the political establishment and against the truth.